Let's take a dive into the colossal machine that was World War I, an unprecedented clash of nations, strategies, and resources that shook the world to its core. Today, we're uncovering the forces behind the war, both human and material, to understand how it became the devastating global phenomenon that shaped the 20th century. When World War I broke out in 1914, it wasn't about one army facing another. Oh no, it was far more complex. The war drew its players from the farthest corners of the globe, transforming what could have been a localized European conflict into a truly world-spanning disaster. But who were the major players, and what gave them the ability to sustain 4 years of ceaseless industrial-scale destruction? Let's start with the Central Powers, led by Germany, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and later joined by Bulgaria. At the center of their coalition was Germany, a rising industrial and military superpower with a vision of dominance. Militarized to the teeth, Germany's massive army, composed of over 13 million men over the course of the war, was widely regarded as Europe's most disciplined. Germany's resources were immense. It had one of the most advanced arms industries in the world, producing millions of rifles, machine guns, and vast quantities of artillery at speeds that sometimes stunned its adversaries. They introduced technological marvels like the U-boat, an early form of the submarine that wreaked havoc on Allied shipping lines. And on land, their resourcefulness didn't stop either. In 1915, Germany shocked the world by deploying one of the deadliest innovations of the war: chemical weapons. Now compare this to the Allies. The Allied powers included France, Britain, Russia, Italy, and eventually the United States in 1917. France bore much of the early brunt of the war, fielding over 8 million soldiers into battle by its end, backed with sturdy fortifications like those along the infamous Western Front. France's industrial capacity allowed it to produce vast reserves of artillery, the queen of the battlefield, and develop its own streak of scientific experimentation, including the early models of tanks. Meanwhile, Britain embraced its role as a maritime superpower. The British Royal Navy was one of the most important forces in the conflict, crippling Germany's ability to trade globally through a naval blockade so effective that it devastated the Central Powers' economy and starved millions. Unlike Germany, which largely had to rely on its Central European allies, Britain's resources stretched across a global empire. They could tap into India, Australia, and Canada for soldiers, supplies, and raw materials. And then there was Russia, an immense yet underdeveloped empire that struggled to industrialize fast enough to keep up with the modern war. The striking contrast between the massive size of the Russian forces and their lack of proper equipment, sometimes soldiers fought without rifles, highlighted the strain the war placed on the Allies' resources. But war wasn't just about the men in uniform or the weapons they carried. Let's talk strategy and logistics. Both sides had to manage mind-boggling amounts of supplies: food for troops, ammunition for guns, fuel for vehicles, and raw materials for factories. And that's where railroads, the circulatory system of war, came into play. European powers understood something critical before the first shots rang out. Wars in the industrial age would be won or lost by how quickly armies could be moved and supplied. Germany perfected this with its Schlieffen Plan, an ambitious strategy meant to swiftly knock France out of the war by invading through Belgium before Russia could fully mobilize in the east. But as we'd soon learn, not all plans survive contact with reality. The Schlieffen Plan failed to secure the quick victory Germany had hoped for, plunging the war into a grinding stalemate. Trenches stretched from the North Sea to Switzerland, forming the infamous Western Front. The war then became not only a test of tactics, but also sheer endurance. It's why this conflict came to be known as a war of attrition, where the goal was to bleed your enemy dry of manpower and resources. And speaking of bleeding dry, let's not forget the immense human cost. Over 65 million men were mobilized globally, including soldiers from colonies like India, Algeria, and Senegal, many of whom fought for their colonial rulers. These soldiers brought their unique skills to the battlefield, but they also bore the alienation and brutal realities of fighting in a war that felt far removed from home. The most decisive contribution, however, came late in the war. By 1917, years of grueling combat had taken its toll on every major power. That was when the United States, largely unscathed by the conflict until then, entered the war with fresh troops, modern equipment, and financial resources.